This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. Hi. What do you guys want to talk about? This is such good shit. Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Remember when these shows used to be long-winded? Back in the good old days, when I actually had an extra half hour to riff on some of these classic shows. I don't know. It just seems like I have less and less to say about so many of these programs. I don't know if that's a me thing, or if the shows are just withering in terms of interesting material to talk about. I really kind of noticed it with the last few Crockett episodes, or just in general, all these post-Clash of Champions shows. They've just been kind of there. You know what I mean? Like, other than the Barry Windham heel turn, there really haven't been a lot of monumental standout moments. Maybe you throw in the temporary Dusty suspension that lasted all of like 3 weeks before they dropped it. I'm still having fun. Don't get me wrong. I'm not burnt out on the classic reviews or anything. I'm just thinking about the audience point of view. Try to have a little bit of fun with this. You know, I don't want these recaps to just turn into standard run-of-the-mill segment rundowns, because that'd be boring. And if there's one thing that I try not to be on this channel, it's boring. Y'all know that. The FSWR channel is here to please. YouTube and Rumble, Monday and Friday, 10 a.m. Eastern. I lied about that last part. I upload the shows when I get to them. We're not on a timestamp here. I'm not that professional. No, I still have a regular day job that keeps me occupied. A couple jobs, as a matter of fact. Because you got to pay the bills somehow. But I'm not going to waste time with the intros here. Y'all came to hear some classic wrestling talk, so let's get into it. NWA Crockett Show. And after last week, having seen quite possibly one of the dumbest angles on NWA programming since we've started these reviews, what I would like to coin the infamous voodoo angle between Kevin Sullivan and Precious. Of all things for them to replay coming out of last week's episode, they chose that. Now, in all fairness, I guess it was more memorable than the 30-second bull rope match between Dusty and Tully. That was a real thing, by the way. You know, at this point in the NWA timeline, we're still a ways out from them plugging any Bash Tour dates. A lot of these early summer syndicated shows are kind of plain, if we're being honest. And that's honestly one of the best ways I can describe this week's show. It was very plain. Just kind of existed. When you look through the archives of all these Saturday night TBS superstars in the Superstation, this one will be a faint memory by the end of it. We opened this week with Arn Anderson and Dave Isley. And the big show they were plugging was the live event the following night in the Omni. The featured match for that card was a six-man tag, with Arn, Tully, and Barry going up against Dusty, Sting, and Flexi Lexi. I believe our first look at Barry standing opposite his former friends that he betrayed. I like during this match, Jim Ross already playing spoiler for the 1988 PWI Manager of the Year Awards, talking about how J.J. Dillon basically had it in the bag for his recruitment of Barry Windham into the Horsemen. Sure enough, guess who the 1988 Manager of the Year was? Voted by PWI. Not that I ever took it seriously to begin with. It is kind of hard to argue, though. I love Jim Cornette. But 1988 was not exactly a banner year for him in the Midnight Express. Could have been if they didn't fuck up the Midnights versus Tully and Arn, but they did. No, moreover, Tully did. Anyway, Arn won with the Gourd Buster. It was probably the least memorable double-A squash in the history of studio wrestling. It did set up a fun little Horseman promo afterwards. They're out there plugging the big six-man for the following night. JJ's putting over all the talent involved, including Dusty, Luger, and The Sting. He actually called him that. Not just Sting. The Sting. And then Tully started the hype for the big Houston barbed wire match between him and Dusty, saying Tully's got plenty of scars on his body to show all the wounds of battle, but he's not going to be in movies, so he embraces the scarring. Promised he'd take Dusty out once and for all. And that took us to Mike Rotunda versus Trent Knight, coming back from break. This is apparently a world television title match. Okay, stop right there. If you tell me with a straight face that you knew prior to this segment that Mike Rotunda was still the TV champion, you are lying. I had completely forgotten about that. Has that guy ever defended the belt once on television? And by that same token, isn't Rick Steiner technically still the Florida heavyweight champion? Or have they finally dropped that? So following the track record of most of the matches this week, they did some moderately boring wrestling moves for a while. The crowd was eerily quiet for most of it. Most of them looked like cardboard cutouts for the majority of the program. And Rotunda eventually went over with a butterfly suplex. And that set up this dynamite Kevin Sullivan mic drop moment. Took about 55 seconds to get there. But the final 5, bro, that was the chef's kiss of one-liners. First off, he's still referring to Precious as Patty for like the billionth time. She knew Sullivan long before she was boinking Jimmy Garvin. And after Sullivan is done building his doomsday cage, that'll be the night Precious comes home to Daddy. At which point, again, this is the best thing Kevin Sullivan has ever said in his entire career. On live cable television, he simply goes, "Last week, Jimmy, while you were flying your airplane, Precious had a to-do list she was filling out. Well, guess what? Kevin Sullivan was the thing for her to do." All right, hang on. I can't resist. I got to throw it up there. No more words need to be spoken about that. So we'll move on. They showed a quick package of Sting beating Mac MacGyver on the Sunday syndicated program. And that set up a post-match interview we had, where not only did he visibly scare the shit out of a poor 8-year-old kid at ringside with Stinger face paint on, but then he basically took another 2 minutes to say essentially nothing. I think he tried to plug the Bash Tour. It failed. I don't think I've ever seen anybody get the most out of saying virtually nothing on the microphone, yet still generate that much enthusiasm from the crowd. He legitimately said nothing of value here. But the people went batshit for him, dude. And that truly is a staple piece in pro wrestling. When you're as over as a guy like Sting was in the mid to late 80s, never mattered what you said or what you did in the ring. Just show fire and be exciting, and you'll get cheered. Charisma is key. That's why today's product sucks so bad. Because nobody has any charisma, and they're all animatronic robots. So then we had Barry Windham versus Ryan Wagner. Windham apparently decided here that he was going to be Road Warrior Barry. Just start breaking out every power move in the book. At one point, he dropped Wagner with a gut wrench. Wagner came down and landed right on top of his shoulder. Did not look fun. And Barry eventually won with a lariat. Then we had JJ and Barry at the interview booth. JJ took a minute to acknowledge Barry's credentials, saying he always knew he was a great athlete, but only in the last couple weeks has he truly realized his full potential. And JJ also realized how special Barry was to not only carry the banner of the Horsemen in the Omni tomorrow night, but to carry the banner of the entire promotion. Of course, he passed the buck over to Barry so he could chime in. Not only has Barry carried the banner for the Horsemen, but he did so when he was alongside Sting, Luger, and Dusty. And only now has he decided to show his true colors, after being held down for so long and never shown the appreciation he deserved. And tomorrow in the Omni, he's going to educate Sting, Luger, and Dusty in more ways than they can imagine. One can only hope he educates more than Al Perez ever could. I think the only thing Perez was good at educating people on was how to cure insomnia. And you watch any of his matches, you know what I'm talking about. Here's everything I wrote down for this match he had with Keith Steinborn. Match is boring. It is going on forever. Perez still has not changed one facial expression since the bell rang. My God, this is eternal. Perez wins with a spinning toe hold. By the way, this is how little Al Perez matches made sense. The so-called setup, the precursor to the spin toe hold, was a forearm lariat off the ropes. So in order for Perez to weaken the leg of Keith Steinborn, he set it up by attacking his face. Seems logical. And then coming back, we had a quick Dusty promo to hype up the Omni match. Really had nothing interesting to say. Just the fact that he's disappointed in Barry and that he taught him better. Promised that the babyfaces would walk in winners and they would walk out winners. Just like the Celtics. Was that a basketball reference? I thought the Celtics were based out of Boston. The Omni is in Atlanta. I have no idea what the hell Dusty was talking about. So then Tully wrestled Dave Spearman, because you could more so call this a mugging than a wrestling match. Tully was like an uncaged animal in there, rubbing Spearman's face in the mat, throwing stiff shots in the corner like he was a punching bag. I was wondering to myself, Is Tully intentionally being this aggressive to sell a point to Dusty? Or did Dave Spearman owe him trans? Poor guy. Oh, eventually Tully won with a slingshot. And that led to this Lex Luger promo, which was like both ironically beautiful and horrible at the same time. As are most Lex Luger promos, if we're being frank. But this one in particular was amazing. Luger's out there trying to call Barry a sellout, saying that he might think the limousines and the fine dining and the women are the lifestyle choices that make him a man. But it's all a lie. It's a facade. Because that's what the Horsemen prey on. They prey on fan appreciation, and then they spit in their face after the fact. And right at the point Luger calls the Horsemen trash, you can audibly hear like half the crowd start to turn on him. Because again, keep in mind, this is 1988. So the fans are like 60-40 split in favor of the Horsemen most of the time. You can tell Luger was catching a lot of flack for this. So upon realizing that he's losing the crowd, he starts to think on his feet. He's like, shit. These people are turning on me. I gotta get them to like me again. What do I do? I've got it. I'll take my shirt off. That'll get the people to like me. So right as Luger goes to remove his striped pink and black shirt, hideous shirt, by the way, that is when all the ladies get horny and they start to cheer for him. They're like, oh my God, pecs, abs, the good stuff. Luger cracked the code. He solved the mystery. Anytime the fans are on the brink of booing him, just remove the shirt. And he'll get all the ladies to love him. The men might not cheer for him, but they'll get drowned out by all the screaming females. See, that's why the baby faces can't be effective anymore. There aren't enough good-looking giant big men that ladies would cheer for on a given night. Because today's baby faces all look like they're 12. And the fact that they never hit a gym in their entire life. That and, come on, let's be honest, there are no lady fans in wrestling anymore. If there are, they're not the kind of ladies that Luger would want to get with. I can tell you that much. So then we had a match that I am not making up. Get this. Kevin Sullivan and Rick Steiner versus Rick Paradise and Rick Allen. Literally, all they needed to do was swap Sullivan with Ric Flair here. It would have been absolute satire. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Rick and Rick versus Rick and Rick. I'm glad it wasn't even remotely competitive. Elsewise, we might have had to hear JR and Tony call spots like, Rick is working over Rick, or Rick is trying to go after Rick. But wait, there's Rick to break up the pin attempt. Pronouns, pal. Pronouns. For whatever reason, they decided to let this run through a commercial break. Not even during any kind of notable heat spot. Steiner's in there just picking apart one of the job guys, tossing him around. Rotunda's out there getting handsy at various points. And then they just kind of cut away randomly while Steiner was running distraction spots. And they come back where Sullivan runs wild for a minute, ends up getting the pin with a double foot stomp. And yes, for those wondering, they did in fact give the win to the man who only represented a quarter of the first name dominance hierarchy here. 3/4 of the men involved were named Rick. So of course, who did they give the win to? Kevin Sullivan. And then, as God is my witness, not making it up, after a tag match where 3 of the participants involved were named Rick, we then go to the interview podium for Ric Flair. And indeed, he was styling and profiling as only the Nature Boy can. Wish I could have gotten a better shot of those white chinos he was wearing. So, well, I believe this is the first segment on the show where they actually acknowledge the Ric Flair Dr. Death World Title Match for the Omni. Tony may have mentioned it in passing, but I mean, they didn't extensively stay on the topic. But Rick plugged that for a minute. Told Steve that he was about to meet his maker in about 24 hours. And then he made some obscure sports reference, which always goes over my head because I don't give a shit about sports. It's pretty much all there was to it. You know, again, it's kind of similar to what I was talking about with Sting earlier. Generally, Ric Flair never had a whole lot to say in terms of promo material. You know, a lot of it was rehashed, recycled catchphrases. But because the guy was so charismatic, you know, the people all went ballistic for his promos. Just because the delivery was so off the charts. But again, he really didn't say much here. Plugged a title match. Did the babyface company publicity speech. Then he wooed at the camera several times. Cut and dry Nature Boy. Then Nikita Koloff beat Bob Riddle with a sickle in about a minute. I wrote nothing else down. Nor did I write anything down about the Al Perez-Gary Hart interview. God bless Gary Hart. No human being alive is going to get me to sit through an Al Perez match and or promo segment. Especially not in long form. Just the mere sight of him standing there blankly looking at the camera. It's enough to bore me to tears. He doesn't even have to say or do anything, and I know it's going to suck. No TV presence at all. Just a fucking walking block of wood. And then we had Larry Zbyszko versus Dark Star. Final match of the show. Another case of me forgetting who the current reigning champions are. Not only is Larry Zbyszko still around the NWA, he's a champion. Specifically, the Western States Heritage Champion. How? How in the fuck is that title still around? After all these years, they still haven't dropped it. The Alabama Junior Heavyweight title was around for seemingly 3 minutes. But this fucking belt, the most empty, worthless regional championship in the history of titles, they won't get rid of it. Oh, by the way, for those wondering, yes, Baby Doll is just gone. No explanation. She's no longer with Zbyszko. I don't believe we ever got a payoff to these secret love letters that her and Dusty were passing along. Still pissed about that. Now we're just back to having standard Larry Zbyszko wrestling matches on TV. He won with a swinging neck breaker. Total filler match. But we did have a great show-closing JC promo to round it out. As you may imagine, he's sweating over the stipulations for the upcoming Midnight's Fantastics match. The stipulations are that the losing team gets 10 lashes apiece with a leather strap. But since the Fantastics are obsessed with Cornette, and they know they can't handle beautiful Bobby and Sweet Stan on their own, Now they managed to hornswoggle in a stipulation where if they win, they get to whip Corny 10 times as well. But Cornette wants to ensure everybody watching at home, he's not afraid. He's not crazy. He's perfectly at ease. Because he knows come bell time, his boys won't let him down. And if the Fantastics are so confident that they can beat the Midnights, they may as well bring their family and dogs down to ringside. That way when the Midnights win, they can whip every last one of their family as well, including the dogs. Pretty sure PETA would have something to say about that. These final moments are great. Is JC shouting, "I'm not crazy. I have not gone mad. I know exactly what I'm doing. The Midnights are going to win. I'm not crazy. You can examine me." And right as they go to the closing credits, you see David Crockett standing there with a look of sheer disbelief. His eyebrows raised, unmoving, probably thinking to himself, this man is off his fucking rocker. But if I say anything, I might get my head ripped off. I'm so glad they chose to end this with a show because nothing else is going to follow it. I love batshit panicky Jim Cornette, where he knows he's screwed 6 ways from Sunday, but he tries to play it off like everything's fine. Boy, is he in for a rude awakening in the Omni, brother. The cake angle was one thing. Now it's time to get serious. Beyond all that, the rest of the show you can pretty much sum up as a 30-second infomercial for the 6-man tag. You got the Horsemen versus all the top babyfaces. Nothing else meant a damn thing outside that one plug. I mean, again, the Bash Tour is still a ways out. You know, they haven't really gone full throttle with the summer hype yet. I am glad the show was only about an hour this week because, frankly, I don't think they needed to add another half hour of squash material. But again, like I said at the beginning, just kind of a very uneventful Crockett episode that didn't have a whole lot going on. But we'll go ahead and flip the page over to Midsouth for a little bit. Definitely a more noteworthy show than the Crockett episode. And one of the leftover teasers they had for this week was the Superdome footage they had prepared for the Von Erichs and the Freebirds. And keep in mind, you know, this is when that feud was white hot over in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. They had a special tag match booked for Louisiana shortly after Kerry had flown all the way from Japan. So right from the jump, we see some of the edited highlights. It is Kerry and David versus Terry Gordy and Buddy Roberts. Man, as soon as you see David on camera with his brother, God, it just makes you sad. You know, just to think where things would end up a little less than a year later. You see David out there in the prime of his career. Looks like $1 million. And you know, there's nothing outlandishly memorable about anything they did here. I mean, I can only imagine for the Louisiana fans how special it must have been seeing a Freebird Von Erich match in person. You know, especially when they were right in the thick of that feud. Yeah, pretty much by this period in 83, the Freebird Von Erich feud was dominating the wrestling scene. It was the bulk of what everybody was talking about. That's how big that whole thing was. People often forget about it. And again, you watch a match like this, it's all basic fundamentals. You know, anytime the heels are getting the heat on Kerry, it's a grab bag of whether or not the offense is going to look any good. He looked totally out to lunch there when Gordy was trying to cut him off from behind. And like you see Buddy trying to slowly push Kerry into the heel corner so he could tag in Gordy. And of course the Von Erichs win. That's not very surprising at all. It's kind of the running gag with a lot of their matches in 83 and 84. Mathematically, it was like 85-15 favorable with the Von Erichs going over the Freebirds. And of course, the Freebirds never lost any heat doing jobs, just because they had so much nuclear heat with the Texas fans. But it's all great stuff. Like, even when you're watching the dark, grainy Superdome floor cam footage, you listen to the crowd reacting. They went nuts for everything. God, and the pop the Von Erichs got when they went over. Like, you'd have thought Kerry and David just saved a baby from a burning building. That's how over this shit was back in 83. And staying on the Superdome footage momentarily, they also aired a King Kong Bundy-Tim Horner match, which I believe was part of the same card the Freebird Von Erich tag match was. Bill Watts puts over the guts and courage of Tim Horner, saying he put on a hell of a showcase with Bundy, but the mass and girth of King Kong Bundy was too much for the green rookie to handle. He didn't actually use the words green rookie. I threw that in there because, well, what can I say? I like ribbing Tim Horner. It's easy. I mean, it was mainly a showcase piece for Bundy. Again, they're really getting over that 5-count gimmick. I still think it's hilarious. We're doing these contrasts between reviewing classic wrestling and modern wrestling. We just talked about Big E the other week. Like, he was working this exact same gimmick back in NXT during the mid-2010s. And of course, different era, different fan base. But you see all the NXT fans going batshit for the 5-count. They're all like, yeah, man, that shit's cool. Meanwhile, in 1983, it generated so much heat with the Southern fans. And you always wonder why I rag on hardcore fans. The modern fan base killed King Kong Bundy's gimmick because they never understood what it was supposed to be in the first place. Again, though, Watts intentionally made sure to put over that Tim Horner clip because it was a lead-in for the match with Tim Horner and the Black Ninja here at the Irish McNeil Boys Club. The O's were banking on another close but no cigar showcase for Tim Horner. And by the end, they were supremely humbled. I kind of figured going into this, man, they're really going out of their way to put over Horner's credentials. They might actually have him win this match. Lo and behold, that is exactly what happened. And he sold a lot for Kendo here. It wasn't a 50-50 back and forth match by any stretch. But they had Horner working from underneath for almost the entire thing. Made a strong comeback at the end. They gave him some frequent hope spots in the middle right before Kendo would cut him off. They also royally screwed up a bridging pinfall attempt. And by that I mean Kendo Nagasaki royally screwed it up. But it worked out perfectly. After Horner fires some clean shots on Kendo, Kendo tries to throw Horner into the ropes, and they do the classic upset flash pin where Horner stops in his tracks and then cradles Kendo in a small package. And while the crowd's going ballistic, and there's General Akbar getting in the ring and trying to claim Horner used the tights. And, this is a big deal. The Black Ninja is somebody that's been heavily featured on the upper mid-card on TV. So it's not like Tim Horner just went out there and beat some ham and egg underneath guy. Now he beat a guy who's part of the top heel faction in Midsouth. And it kind of opens up the window for creative freedom if they decided to book Horner in tag matches with guys like Mr. Wrestling 2 or maybe Hacksaw Duggan. Because those guys are still currently engaged with the Rat Pack right now. And they've been pushing Horner in stages throughout 1983. But up until this point, he never really had a breakthrough victory that elevated him to the next status on the card. And this helped to facilitate that. So I like this. Good segment. They got me curious to see what was going to happen with Tim Horner. Statement that I never thought I would hear myself say. And then following that, We had Johnny Rich versus Tony Torres. Basic showcase squash for Rich. It was not terribly noteworthy or interesting. I mean, both guys were baby faces here, so they kind of worked it as such. Overall, they just did some standard boring wrestling until Rich won with... I'm not kidding, I actually wrote this down as a move. A running inside cradle pin. Here's what happened. Johnny runs toward Tony, who is crouched over his knees, at which point he wrestles him onto his back, hooks a leg, and pins him. Didn't even have to pick him up and slam him. He just grapevined a leg, and he won. Never seen anything like it before. And of course, it was during this segment where Boyd Pierce had to remind us of how exciting pro wrestling was. Literally during the most boring segment in the history of Mid-South. How ironic. Then we had the Super Destroyer and Tony Zane versus the Junkyard Dog and Hacksaw Butch Reed. Good story implication with seeing JYD and Reed paired together. One of the central stories they'd been pushing with Reed was how much of an inspiration the Junkyard Dog was for his career. He's the guy that made him decide he was going to transition from pro football to pro wrestling. And of course, as you hear Watts talk about this stuff mid-match, as a smart fan, your natural inclination is to think, all right, when is Butch Reed turning? Not to get ahead of things, because they are going somewhere with this. They didn't really do anything to tease the idea of anybody turning heel here directly. There was a miscue spot during the closing moments where Reed went to try to drop an elbow on the Super D, but he accidentally caught JYD by mistake. It was totally accidental. And it kind of broke down into the usual pandemonium you'd expect. Ref distractions galore, four-way brawls. And it ends with Super Destroyer trying to give Reed a superplex, but the Dog slips in to cut him off. And then after dropping Tony Zane with a thumper, Butch Reed catches Super D with a shoulder tackle off the middle rope. And, well, indeed, the Dog pinned Tony Zane, who I do not believe was the legal partner at the time. I remember Zane tagged in Destroyer toward the end, right before they did the four-way brawl spot. I don't believe there was ever a tag back out to Zane. Not that the finish was ever in doubt. I mean, there's no way the babyfaces weren't winning the match. Again, you could tell it was designed to set up something for bigger down the road. The miscue spot with Dog and Reed was the ultimate teaser. Then coming back, we had Ted DiBiase beating Ron Ellis in relatively short fashion. Aside from the spot where Ellis legitimately paused so he could bend over to let DiBiase kick him in the face, I really had nothing to add here. DiBiase won with a power slam. Short and sweet. And then we had our featured bout. Butcher Paul Buchan squaring off with a very game, pissed off Hacksaw Duggan. And, well, here's the best way I can describe what went down here. If Hacksaw Duggan were not the most over babyface in Mid-South by this point in 83, we may have set a record for an all-time god-awful TV match. And look, I get Paul Buchan was in the twilight of his career. Physically, he was very limited with what he could do in the ring. He and Duggan looked like two drunk deer on ice skates. Just whiffing blows left and right. No selling shit back and forth. I know I often use the cliche, the windmill punch deal. Pretty much how to describe horrible-looking offense. That is exactly what it looked like watching these guys teeing off on each other. It was so bad. Again, though, Duggan was more over than God in this segment, so the people went ballistic for him. They do a spot at the end where Alfred Neely gets bumped in the corner. Skandar Akbar tries to hit the ring to attack Duggan, but his plan was foiled. And while Duggan's yanking on Akbar's collar, here comes DiBiase to hit the ring. And those guys momentarily go at it while Akbar tries to slide in a chair. And then from there, Duggan's swinging the chair around like a wild man. Ends up clocking Vachon over the head with it and gets the pinfall. It was made better by the fact that not only was the chair totally unobstructed, after Duggan won, he then proceeded to grab the chair, swing it in the air directly in front of Alfred Neely. Somehow Alfred Neely did not see it. And/or he just shrugged it off and went, No, nothing suspicious about that. I'll bet. So just to recap, match was terrible. I mean, it only went like 4 minutes. So in good conscience, I cannot call it the worst match of all time. It's probably like the last time we see Paul Vachon in Midsouth, too. 2 appearances on television. They've already beaten him clean and then cut his balls out from under him. So thanks for coming, Butcher. And that left enough time in the show for a Mr. Olympia standby match with Jerry Caldwell. And they really went down to the wire with this one. Olympia got the win with a sleeper just shy of the final closing moments of airtime. And Watts had just enough time to revisit some of the timeline with Mr. Olympia and Ted DiBiase as the Mid-South Tag Team Champions. Brought up the Superdome show where Olympia pulled double duty after successfully recapturing the tag belts from Wrestling 2 and Tiger Conway. Then he had to wrestle JYD in the cage match later for the North American title. And he lost that belt, which he claimed was a farce. It was kind of good for them to bring it up again because, I actually kind of forgot about who the current Mid-South Tag Team Champions were. I knew Dog was a North American champ, even though he hasn't been coming out with the belt recently. I think I was still under the impression that Wrestling 2 and Conway were still the champions. That is one thing when you go back and rewatch these old classic tapes, you kind of realize championship reigns were usually kept pretty short. Unless you were the NWA World Champion. So if you really weren't paying close attention, it's very easy to forget who the current champions are in the various territories. Especially when belts changed hands on live events. It was very frequent. And that's why it's also great having Bill Watts out there, just making sure to stress the important details like that. Kind of another week in Mid-South where not a whole lot was going on. A couple angles spruced in throughout the show, but it was a lot like last week. Story development was very one note. They're still heavily favoring the Rat Pack Duggan feud. And then there's a lot of squash material to round out the card. Tim Horner's upset win over the Black Ninja got a good reception. It's weird, though. I don't seem to remember them doing a whole lot with Horner in Mid-South until he and Brad Armstrong formed the Lightning Express later on. And even then, they were only really a mid-card tag team. They were sort of in and out throughout most of 87, too. Yeah, this mid-83 period is just very odd looking back. Like, I seem to recall having more memories of Mid-South from this point through late 83. But so far, we're vastly approaching June. Like, a lot of this stuff seems like I'm watching it for the first time. Even the stuff with Duggan and the Rat Pack. I really don't remember that feud as best I thought I did. And they're definitely slow burning a lot of the bill for those top programs. Well, turns out I was right. They did air a third week of the Texas Stadium show, but it was only the Ric Flair Kevin Von Erich World Title Match. And you will be shocked to hear me say this. It was miles better than the 2 matches they booked for the Sportatorium this week. Hard to believe, right? Who'd have thunk it? That both Brian Adias versus Thor and Chris Adams versus Mike Reed were significantly less exciting than Kevin Von Erich and Ric Flair wrestling for the world title in front of 25,000 plus people. Even Bill Mercer couldn't pretend to be remotely interested in Thor. Although he was more physically imposing than Brian Adias. God bless the guy. He also had a great line during this match. I believe Thor either referred to Adias here as a worm or squirt. Either way, it was funny. I kind of like squirt. And this was mainly just background noise so Mercer could take a few minutes to recap the highlights of Texas Stadium. Mainly brought up Gary Hart, noting the hair match with Kerry and the one-man gang. Which is great too, because Mercer was very subtle with his descriptions of how that angle went down, noting that Gary's hair was cut. I would more so refer to it as a strictly forced head shaving. It was not your average trip to the local barber shop. Too much blood involved. Aside from Mercer talking about the Gary Hart stuff, I didn't note anything else about this aside from Thor making fun of Brian's height, and then a Brian Adias won with a crossbody off the middle rope. Total buffer match. And they followed that with a fun little pre-tape promo where Mercer tracked down Chris Adams and Gino Hernandez outside the International Athletic Club. And right as Gino and Chris were getting ready to hit the road in their Corvette, Mercer was there to ask him about the falloff in the 12-man tag. Specifically, their premeditated assault on Kevin's new Lincoln Mercury sports car. And their reason for smashing the windshield with a chain? Because they're heels. They're pricks. That was basically it. That was their justification. Quite blunt. We're assholes, Bill. Any more questions? Now, of course, Bill's trying to berate them for it and talk about the fact that Kevin plans to get his revenge. Translation, Kevin is going to somehow find a way to destroy Gino and Chris's sports car. But the heels are not threatened, because they're already one step ahead of the Von Erichs. I love during this interview, too. This whole thing is taking place right outside the main entrance of the club. So you got vendors walking in and out of the building, making deliveries and such. And all the while, you get Gino and Chris there actively poking fun at the poor 9-to-5 lowlifers. Like in the background, you see vendors looking at the camera like, I guess he's right. It was the perfect knife twist into the jugular. Making sure the rich snobs let everybody know how much better they are. Because, you know, they've got money. Classic shit, man. Then we came back for a Chris Adams squash win over Mike Reed. Much like the opener, there really wasn't anything important to say about it. At some point during this match, Bill Mercer randomly started making plugs about famous chain restaurants in Milwaukee. I guess World Class was doing some kind of live event there. I was not entirely clear what was going on. But I do know Mercer started talking about crab cakes. And I was very confused. Adams won with a super kick in like 2 minutes. And it all paled in comparison to the real highlight for this week. The highlighted footage of Ric Flair and Kevin Von Erich for the world title in its entirety. And Flair versus Kerry from the year prior, it was not. Now, that match had much better story implication and a lot of emotion behind it. And it's not to totally dismiss Kevin versus Flair the following year. I mean, by the end of this thing, they were really milking the emotion for all it was worth. And again, we've actually seen these two wrestle for the title already on Dallas TV, going all the way back to 83. You might recall, that was the match where they had done the visual pin where Kevin had Flair pinned down for the 3 count, but they pulled a classic Dusty finish where the decision was reversed because the ref had seen Kevin throw Flair over the top rope well before the second pinfall attempt. And the controversy was over the indecisive conclusion of how they capped that feud off. So here we are 2 years later, Texas Stadium. Kevin finally getting his opportunity to close the chapter on the Ric Flair book. And of course, when you're comparing the Flair matches between both brothers, it's always safe to say that visually, the Flair-Kevin matches will always supersede the Flair-Kerry matches, just in terms of the execution of spots and structure. Kevin was always more naturally gifted in the ring than Kerry, so, he and Flair always looked so seamless with everything they did. Like, I could try to break down everything move for move, but it was such a heated back-and-forth fight. I'd be here for another 45 minutes if I wanted to dive into specifics. Again, for a guy like Flair, it was probably just another typical day at the office. I can't even begin to imagine what it was like working in that outdoor environment, though, man. I mean, you could tell, especially by the last few minutes, these guys were gassed. As great as Flair's cardio was, even he was struggling by the end there. And it was hot. And the whole thing exceeded 30 minutes. Easily. Like, when you factor in the pacing of the match, the structure, the fact that it was just bam, 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 go, go, go from bell to bell. I mean, it's already hard doing shit like that in a regular indoor venue. Crank up the heat by like 40 degrees with that sun beaming down on you. God, that must have been a miserable experience. But they worked so well together. Flair did all his usual spots. Everything was built around the drama of the near falls. All those critical moments where Kevin had the pins on Flair, but he just couldn't execute that 3 count. And the fans stayed with it for the entire match. I did note the copious amounts of ass grabbing going on here from both guys. Better known as the tight pole spot. Whenever you'd have the heel try to lock the babyface in the abdominal stretch, but he would use the tights for leverage. I saw the way Flair was yanking at Kevin's tights, though, dude. At one point, he legitimately had the claw hooked on Kevin's ass cheeks. Definitely copping a feel. I don't care what anybody says. But you get the last few minutes where both guys are at each other's throats. It's already hostile by this point. After the constant brawling in and out of the ring, Kevin kind of getting fed up with Flair's bullshit. So Kevin finally gets the claw locked in, and they're basically fighting in and out of the ring for like 2 minutes straight. Rick Hazard's completely unable to gain any sense of control, so he finally throws the match out after both guys spilled out to the floor and kept ignoring his counts. It kind of boils over to where Kevin finally has his Ralphie moment. Keeps the claw locked in on Flair, refuses to let go, and he eventually snaps and tosses Rick Hazard out of the ring. And you get David Manning, Mike, and Kerry filing out from the back to try to talk some sense into him. And by that, I mean, they basically looked at him and went, "Stop, please, don't, you'll kill him." It was about as unenthused as you could possibly imagine. It was kind of humorous, actually. I mean, to be fair, David was at least trying to be somewhat bipartisan. The brothers, not so much. But finally, it turns out Fritz is the voice of reason. He comes in and tells Kevin that it's over, dude. Live to fight another day, son. And you see Kevin back away, kind of realizing that he totally snapped. And you get the family there to comfort him. It is a pretty big, heavy moment, all things considered. When you think about the story implication here, this is 2 years of pent-up frustration. Kevin finally got his chance to get even with the guy that left by the skin of his teeth in Dallas with the title, when Kevin literally had the belt in his hand. And not only did he get screwed again, but when he finally had that moment, and he had enough of Flair, he could have ended his career for good. He still didn't have the heart to finish the job. It was all fantastic. Can't say enough good about it. And obviously the feel-good moment from '84 with Kerry actually winning the title, that moment always resonates better with fans just because you actually get to see the babyface triumph. Here you could kind of call it another screwjob finish. And as you'll see, that winds up coming back to bite the company in the ass. But you absolutely need to go out of your way to see this match if you haven't already. It's a brilliant world title match. Both guys worked their asses off in some really uncomfortable settings. But they pulled through, gave the people a classic world title main event. And while the attendance figures stayed pretty steady going into the third one next year, this is kind of where that tipping point is pretty noticeable for future Dallas tapings. Going into that summer, early fall of '85, we're about to see the landscape change pretty drastically for this region. But we'll keep documenting that as we move through the library. So, yeah. Rounds out another stellar Friday edition. And again, this one's going to go up probably later on Friday because I'm going to have another busy day. So if you don't see this one until in the evening, that's why. But thanks everybody for watching. I always appreciate the support where I can get it. Make sure you guys come back to check out the show on Monday because I think we got some big things coming up. Is it the King of the Ring? Or the King Queen of the Ring? Sorry, I do not want to offend. Is that really what the show's called? King and Queen of the Ring? Wow. Yep, May 25th. That is on Saturday. So, we're going to leave out the SmackDown report then. 10 a.m. Oh, wait, no, that's Pacific time. 1 Eastern. Got it. Well, we'll see how that goes. All right. Thanks, everybody, for watching, and I'll catch you guys soon. Peace out.